Good evening. Hi. Hi. Welcome back. Welcome to Musing. I'm Seth. I'm the curator. I'm clearly having vocal issues tonight. I know. So I won't be talking much. I know. But you'll be hearing some great stories from some wonderful storytellers. You're in for another great treat tonight. We've been working together for the past 2 to 3 months as a group. Actually individual rehearsals, but then as a group. They're all wonderful, and I'm excited to share their stories with you. So, if you would please do me a favor before we start, make sure your cell phones are turned off. That would be wonderful. I'll give you a moment to do that. All right, let's get started. Our first storyteller was born and raised in Glenwood, Iowa, and resides there currently. She is an alumnus of the University of Iowa, and she passionately loves the littlest humans and gets paid to hang out with them as a preschool special education teacher for the Council Bluffs School District. When she is not wrangling small children, she enjoys spending time with her rescue Frenchie Luna, her almost grown sons Luke and Sam, her partner TJ, and her tribe of badass girlfriends. Her favorite things include, but are not limited to, cupcakes, mochas, trees, books, and naps. And here to tell a story she calls The Day My Heart Broke, please welcome Laura Kelly.
That's good. Yep. Wednesday, July 6th, 2016. I open my eyes. I'm lying in a bed, and I'm staring at a clock on a wall straight in front of me. It's a little before 10, and it's light in the room, so I'm thinking 10 in the morning. I look to my left, and there's a doorway. My sons Luke and Sam are walking through it, followed by their dad, Pat, my ex-husband. Am I in a hospital? How did I get here? What day is it? What's going on? The story of how I ended up in a hospital room on Wednesday, July 6, 2016, is a story that was told to me, not a story that I remember. The reason I don't remember it is because on July 6, 2016, I was returning to consciousness after having been placed in a coma following a full cardiac arrest 4 days earlier. Before I ended up in that hospital bed, I was a healthy 47-year-old woman. A mom of 2 kids, 2 sons, a preschool special education teacher, a 4-H club leader, a wannabe gardener, sometimes a runner, a crafter, a book lover, a daughter, a friend, just an ordinary woman, doing her stuff, living her life, loving her people. And the time between that before and after, gone. A lot of things happened to my body in that span of time. I remember none of them. The Saturday of my cardiac arrest, I spent most of the morning helping my then boyfriend Scott clean out his rental property. And later that evening back at Scott's house, my chest started hurting a lot. And I couldn't get settled or comfortable. I tried laying down. It didn't make a difference. And I started to get worried because that did not feel normal. So I decided to call my ex-husband, Pat, to see what he thought I should do. He has a PhD in physiology and is kind of my go-to for all kinds of medical concerns. My youngest son, Sam, answered the phone, and he told me that his dad was outside mowing the lawn. And I must have sounded bad, or maybe he sensed urgency in my voice because soon after, I heard Pat on the other end of the phone. I sat on the stairs at Scott's house, clutching my chest, hunched over in pain, as I heard Pat tell me that I should probably go get it checked by the doctor. And that conversation is the last thing that I remember until I was staring at a clock on a hospital room wall 4 days later. The rest of the story of what happened that night was told to me. And to be honest with you, it was horrifying not to remember any of it myself. But as I've been told, here is how the rest of that evening unfolded. After that conversation with Pat and the chest pain that would not stop, Scott drove me to the nearest urgent care. Neither of us thought I was having a heart attack, and the urgent care was closer than the nearest hospital. I walked into the urgent care, handed the receptionist my insurance card, and they quickly got me back to an exam room and let Scott come along. Of course, because of my symptoms, they did an EKG right away, and it was normal. So they thought I was probably having heartburn, and they gave me a little dose of Maalox. And not long after that, the nurse came back to see how I was feeling, where was my pain. And I told her I thought maybe I felt a little bit better. And then I fell off the exam table onto the floor and started seizing. The nurse kicked the door open and yelled for the receptionist to call 911, and someone started chest compressions. The paramedics arrived, and they took over the CPR. My heart was defibrillated, and when I was stable enough to transport, I was rushed into the back of an ambulance and taken to Methodist Hospital. Scott followed that ambulance in his car, not knowing what the outcome would be once he got there. And when he got to the hospital, there were people rushing in and out of my room in the ER, and he was not allowed to go in. Months later, I went back to get my medical records from both the urgent care and the hospital that night. It was really important for me to piece together the information that I had been told with the facts recorded in those official documents. And after I gathered them, I drove to a nearby parking lot so that I could sit and read them in my car. It was the Michaels parking lot on 72nd Street. I opened the envelope and took out the paperwork, and my eyes fell on the sobering words, patient unresponsive, no pulse detected. My medical records show that even though I was alive when I was brought to the hospital, I was not coherent. And I believe that was a major reason that they decided to put me in a medically induced coma, also known as therapeutic hypothermia or code chill. Before I was discharged from the hospital, I learned that the cause of my cardiac arrest was SCAD, or spontaneous coronary artery dissection. A SCAD occurs when the lining of your artery tears or dissects, and this can cause a blockage or a disruption to blood flow, which can result in a heart attack, cardiac arrest, or death. Afterwards, people asked me if I was angry at God for letting this happen to me, and I was shocked by that question because I honestly don't even remember thinking that, not even once. But I was pissed at my body. I was a healthy 47-year-old woman, an exerciser, a non-smoker. I remember thinking, what the hell? I've treated you well my whole life. You pull this shit? I don't even eat bacon. I felt so let down by my body, and I no longer trusted it. And I knew that I needed to change that in order to move forward. When I was at home recovering, I found a group of SCAD survivors on Facebook, and that group was truly instrumental in helping me recover both emotionally and psychologically. And through that group, I found that a major fundraiser for the study of SCAD is an annual 5K race in Naperville, Illinois, sponsored by SCAD Research Incorporated, an organization founded by a man who lost his wife to SCAD when she was only 51. That next spring, I started training to run that 5K. And in May of 2017, I hopped in my car and I drove 8 hours all by myself so that I could meet other SCAD survivors in person for the first time and run that 5K. I crossed the finish line on May 6, 2017, exactly 10 months from the day of the clock on the hospital room wall, which for me is the beginning of my SCAD story. And I ran every step of that 5K to prove to myself that my body could be trusted again. And when I crossed the finish line, I burst into tears. It's now been almost 7 years since SCAD interrupted and changed my life. And that first SCADiversary, as we SCAD survivors like to call it, was a really hard day. I felt guilty. So many women have died from SCAD, and I spent that whole day wondering, why did I survive when they didn't? I've mostly let go of the survivor's guilt, And days can now go by when I don't even think about SCAD. In fact, last year, which would have been the 6th SCADiversary, it wasn't until a few days later that I realized that I had passed that milestone again. But even though SCAD has faded to the background of my daily life, it still rears its ugly head every now and then, and always with a side order of fear. Every time chest pains start, I have to push through an avalanche of worry thoughts. 20 to 30% of people who have had a SCAD have a second occurrence. So my fears are not entirely unreasonable. The Wednesday night before Thanksgiving last year, mid-afternoon, I am in the middle of full-on food prep for our family meal that evening. And I start having severe chest pain. And honestly, those chest pains were as severe as what I remember the night that I actually had that cardiac arrest. It was scary and upsetting. And I remember thinking, okay, you just have to finish the food and finish the meal, and then what? Then it's okay to stop and have a cardiac arrest, right? Well, luckily, those pains subsided, and I felt reasonably confident that I did not need to go to the emergency room that evening. And I remember sitting at the table after the meal with TJ. My friend Crystal and I had signed up to run the Omaha Turkey Trot the next morning. And I said, hey, what's a great thing to do the morning after severe chest pains as a cardiac survivor? I know, run a 5K, right? Yes. Well, I did end up getting up the next day, and I did run that 5K with a turkey hat on my head. And about halfway through that race, I felt tears streaming down my face. It was a cold day. They were not cold weather tears. Those tears said, pardon my French, fuck you, SCAD. And as I crossed the finish line, I asked myself, Laura, are you gonna live in fear, or are you going to live? When I was in the ICU in my code shell coma, there were only 3 people who were allowed to be in the room with me. My mom, my ex-husband, Pat, and my boyfriend at the time, Scott, the one who was there when it all happened. I am fiercely protective of our privacy, but I will tell you that there was no love lost between Pat and Scott. But even so, Pat and I have a bond that remains unbroken, even through divorce and heartbreak. And speaking of heartbreak, Pat was the one who drove me to my first cardiology appointment after I was discharged from the hospital because I couldn't yet drive myself. And when we pulled into the parking lot, he stopped me from getting out of the car and he said, Laura, do you remember what you said to me the day they extubated you? Warily, I said, no, I don't remember. And he said that I had asked to speak with him alone. And when we had privacy, I said, I know why this happened to me. My heart broke because I broke your heart first. This is one of the most vulnerable and heart-wrenching parts of my story, and one that I have not widely shared. But I am sharing it to remind you that our hearts have such depth and breadth. And if we let them, they are strong enough and big enough to carry enormous amounts of grief and love simultaneously. And that feels really beautiful to me. Are you going to live your life in fear, or are you going to live? I'm choosing to live. And sometimes that means being brave, and sometimes it means having tears. Sometimes it means heartbreak, literal, figurative, or both. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. All right, our next storyteller is an Omaha-based multimedia visual artist and filmmaker who has received several national and international awards for his work. He was a TEDx Omaha speaker in 2018, and his current project, the Museum of Alternative History, was shown at Kaneko and is currently being turned into a large coffee table-sized art book. His films, including Missing Piece, have won numerous Best Documentary Awards, the 2017 Humanitarian Award, as well as Audience Awards and several Special Jurors Awards, among others. His work has been shown widely, including in Wales, the UK, Sweden, Bucharest, Sydney, Hiroshima, Greece, and Italy. And he's also a professor at Creighton University. I encourage you to Google his name and TEDx Omaha after this show to have your mind blown. With his story, A Difficult Journey, please welcome Tim Guthrie.
I was on a trip around several countries in Europe with my little brother Max. We wanted to travel together, but I also wanted to spread my late wife's ashes in places that she and I had traveled to on our honeymoon. Spreading her ashes after her untimely death had become my mission in life. Because I also wanted to find very specific locations that meant a lot to us, I carried photos from our honeymoon, initially to help identify those precise locations. Taking new photos wasn't my original goal. However, eventually, I began to hold up the old photos and take new photos in the same locations, lining up the old photo over the landscape, like you've probably seen people do with old black and white World War II photos. The result looks like two photos, one old, one new, stitched together to create a new image. The juxtaposition between the past and the present poignantly illustrates loss and remembrance. It just felt appropriate. One of the places we visited was Paris, France. And after an exhausting search hiking around much of Paris, I had found all of the locations except one. Every person I showed the photo to thought it was taken near a bridge, which made sense since you can see clearly the River Seine in the background. The afternoon of our last full day in Paris, Max and I were visiting different parts of the city. He was searching for his niece, and I had no more photos to take except that bridge photo. Over time, however, I realized the photo must have been taken from a balcony or a rooftop, not a bridge. Although I didn't recall ever being on a rooftop, seems like the kind of thing you'd remember. So I really, really wanted to get that final image, though. I became obsessed because I didn't want to miss a single thing. It felt like I would fail her somehow if I didn't get that last image. It quickly became the most important thing in the world to me. So Max and I split up. He went to find his niece, and I went on a mission to get that last photo somewhere along the River Seine. I walked along the south side of the river, always looking north for the most recognizable feature in the photo, the iconic ivory domes of Sacré-Cœur. At the same time, I was studying the rooftops on the south side of the river, trying to figure out which building made sense. After 15 minutes of walking, nothing looked right, so I turned around and went back the other direction. Eventually, I ended up near the Musée d'Orsay, and I realized it was possible. It could have been taken from a balcony there. I suddenly had a recollection of wandering through the museum with Beth, and I vaguely recalled we did step outside somehow. I kept studying the top of the building, and when I saw the spot, I immediately realized that's where the photo was taken. So I held the photo up and made complete sense. Victorious, I jogged to the entrance. It had just closed a few minutes earlier at 5 p.m. I asked the guard when the last people had to leave. I was told 6. I begged him to let me in, but he refused. I walked away realizing how close I was and what little things needed to have had happened for me to have made it on time. Waking up earlier, having the good fortune of going toward the museum when I first exited the metro, or heading down to the area the day before, and so on. At one point, he let a handful of people back in, so I went back. He said they already had tickets, they just needed back in for something. It became obvious he seemed to be enjoying denying me, so I walked away muttering obscenities under my breath at myself more than anything. A few Americans had exited, so I stopped and asked, "Can I have one of your tickets, if you don't mind?" Generously, they gave me a ticket. Naturally, the guard refused me again. He said it was a discount ticket for a child. I pleaded again, nothing. So I left, muttering more obscenities, not so under my breath. And the couple saw me, and they walked back, and "He didn't let you in?" I explained why he didn't, and then the whole family gathered together to find an adult ticket. The husband said, "Surely with an adult ticket, they'd let you in." "No," I responded, "the guy's on a power trip. At this point, he won't let me in for any reason." The husband tried anyway. Sure enough, he was denied, and then he started to get upset. The guard at the door said, "That's your ticket, not his," more arguing. I just gave up and left. Unfortunately, there was no way to go back the next morning because it didn't open until 9:30, and we had a train to catch at 10:29. There simply wasn't enough time. That night, everyone that heard the story was incredulous. Max said, "It's interesting. The guy was on a power trip, but oddly, he had the power to let you in, which also would have been a gratifying use of his power." I thought about it a lot that night. I calculated if everything went right, maybe I could pull it off. But really, any single snag could unravel the plan. A long line for tickets, a slow ticket line, a late train could ruin it, getting her on or off at the wrong station. The balcony could be closed for renovations or permanently, or it simply might not open until later in the day. But I took a shot. I woke up hours early, got Max up, and we went to Gare l'Est, which was the departing station for Luxembourg at 10:29. Max sat down for coffee, watched the bags while I raced to the museum. I purchased my metro tickets in advance, so I didn't have to stop for anything on my way back. But when I arrived at the museum, there was already a long line, and I realized the plan might already be doomed. And I promised Max, if it looked like anything would stop me, I would turn around and return to the station. I walked up to the line anyway, listening for an American accent. And when I heard one, I stopped. I said, "This is going to sound weird. I just need to go into the museum today to take a single photograph, and then I need to race off to catch a train." The guy interrupted me and said, "You want to cut in line?" Yes, but it would mean so much to me. The husband and wife smiled. They let me in. I thanked them profusely, and the woman said, "Let me get you to the front of the line." There were at least 30 people in front of us, and no, I insisted, "This is already a huge help. I'll be fine." But she went ahead anyway. When she returned, she said, "Go ahead." I protested, but then she explained everybody was part of a huge tour group. They were all together. So there I was, first in line, in a line that had already grown to more than a couple hundred, an hour before the museum even opened. They'd likely saved the day. But then the museum didn't open on time. It was 5 minutes late, then 10 minutes late. I realized I still might have to abandon the attempt before they even opened the doors. And as I was considering just that, the doors finally opened, nearly 15 minutes late. I raced to the counter, got my ticket while showing the person the photo, but she wasn't able to help. So I ran past an amazing amount of famous artwork, barely glancing at any of it. I kept asking for the way to the top. I got to the back of the museum, and I was told the balcony is closed. My heart sank. It wouldn't open until 11 a.m. I told them I just needed to take a photo. Nope, not possible. I started to plead with the guard. One guard, who had been silent, started speaking to the other one. They began arguing in French. Finally, they said, if I went up to the cafe, maybe someone could let me out, but the first guy doubted it. So I thanked them and I ran. I ran up a moving escalator. I ran up 5 floors. I ran past Monets, Manets, Degas, Cézannes, Gauguins, Renoirs, Van Goghs. I ran until I arrived at the top and showed the photo to the first employee I saw. She said, the balcony is not open. I explained why it was incredibly important, that I'd only be a minute. I needed to run and catch a train. She said I could go back, but it was locked. I couldn't go out. I ran into another person, and again was told no. More begging. A crowd of employees started to gather around me. I pleaded. They wanted a greater explanation, and someone eventually asked, who's in the photo? It's my wife, I said, suddenly fighting emotions. She had recently passed away. I'm traveling, trying to spread her ashes, and taking photos in places we went on our honeymoon. Please, it'll only take a second. Someone made a phone call. About a dozen people engaged in hushed discussions. One woman asked me if I needed to sit and calm down. I just repeated, I can't miss my train. I looked at my watch. It was 9:50. I told myself, no matter how close I got, I was turning around at 9:55 to make sure I got back to the station on time. There was no time to spare. So I was forced to take the only picture of the location I could through a window. I realized it might be the only chance I would get to capture any image at all. Then the man who made the phone call motioned for me to follow him. I walked to the door that led to the balcony. It was electronically locked. He couldn't open it. He pulled out a walkie-talkie and started speaking to someone. The first woman that initially denied me access to the balcony walked up. You could see she now felt bad and wanted to help or at least comfort me. We had to wait for someone with a special device to send an unlock code to the door. Unfortunately, I couldn't wait. It was 9:55. I had gotten so close. I could see where Beth and I stood 2 decades earlier. It brought back memories I'd nearly forgotten. But those memories would have to be enough. I told myself, at least I tried. I almost made it. I'd solved the puzzle of the old photo. I'd found the location it was taken. I got to relive memories. It hadn't been a total loss. I took a few crappy photos through the glass from the wrong angle, but something felt better than nothing. And how important were the photos anyway? They weren't supposed to be my goal. Then suddenly, the electronic clicked. The door released, popped open, and I immediately ran out. I lined up the old photo with the view across the river and fired so many photos so quickly that the camera froze up trying to write the images. I briefly paused and reviewed, took a handful more, and quickly turned to the door. You can stay as long as you like. What's the fastest way out of the museum, I asked. He pointed. I ran. It was a staircase, and I was already sweating, but I ran down the staircase as fast as I could, fearing I was going to lose my footing and tumble all the way down. I ran to the exit. Someone called something to me. I ignored her, exited, and ran toward the nearest metro station. It was 10 o'clock. I feared my tenacity had cost us our train to Luxembourg, but I ran, and I ran, and I ran. Somehow, amazingly, I made it to the station with barely a minute to spare. Max was patiently waiting, seemingly not worried at all. We grabbed our bags, and we headed to the platform where the train awaited us. I was spent, absolutely exhausted and saturated in my own sweat. But I did what I set out to do. I got the picture. Thank you.
I don't know how many times I've heard that story, and every time I'm on the edge of my seat. Beautiful, beautiful. All right, our next storyteller is a happily married humorist with 2 great kids. With a background in communication arts, she has wound a very unconventional career path that currently finds her rangering and creating content for the National Park Service. She also started 2 passion-led companies called Tiny Lake Productions and Andy the Goose, LLC. And she is someone to watch for because she has some very exciting productions in the works, including a long-awaited live theater experience called Andy Interrupted, a one-woman show about the true story of not telling the best story not told. The Andy the Goose story. That's it. And tonight we hear a story from her unique childhood titled Eminent Domain. Please welcome Jessica Korgie.
Hi. In June of 1942, 232 farms were taken by eminent domain outside of Hastings, Nebraska, separating people from their land and their legacies and their family histories. And in 1 month's time, 49,000 acres were under construction to build the Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot. And in 1 year, bombs and missiles and torpedoes and projectiles rolled off of production lines and onto the rail lines headed to the Pacific Fleet. The Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot supplied the United States Navy with 40% of its firepower during World War II. And 40 years later, in 1984, I was 9 and completely oblivious to the history of the land and the structures of the place that I called home. You see, my grandpa, my dad's dad, Grandpa Gene, who was an inventor and an entrepreneur, quickly snapped up 80 acres to build a home and a manufacturing company. I didn't know that our factory with the grass-covered bunker attached that I loved to sled down was once a medium projectile loading plant. And I didn't know that the huge rectangle brick and cement building I lived in was once the mess hall and showering quarters of a segregated workforce. But what I did know was that our Navy base was the greatest place to grow up. Our place was huge. It had a north end and a south end and a big warehouse in the middle. And if you walked into the north end, you'd walk into this landing, and there was these 2 giant staircases, one that went up to my grandparents' place and one that went down to our place where my mom and dad and sister and I lived. And the landing between was like this decked out Spanish room. It had red carpet and bullfighting tapestries, and there was these 2 giant taxidermy golden eagles that were perched on a tree branch suspended from the ceiling, always peering down. And there was an exit there too. It went into one of these covered ramps that spider-legged off the building and went all the way to the factory. And then on the south end, you'd walk in, and there was a landing, 2 giant staircases, one that went up to our Fleming manufacturing offices, and then another set that went down to this island-themed 1970s rec room. There was a bar and a dance floor, and there was netting with seashells and a poker table and a craps table and twinkly lights and more taxidermy animals. There were sub-basements, too, below the north and south end. Underneath the offices, there was this big, noisy, scary boiler that my dad said could blow at any time. So I rarely went down there. And then we had the sub-basement that was below our place, and that was just filled with stuff. It had, like, furniture from the 1960s. It had old Christmas decoration shelves of glassware. And then there was this 4-foot by 4-foot hole in the wall that just went into this dark abyss. It was a tunnel entry that just kind of snaked into the unknown. And my dad said that an ogre lived in there, and he would go in there and he would bellow this ogre's bellow, and it would reverberate through our apartment, and I always knew that it was him, but it was an effective deterrent. There was also this odd cupboard kind of up towards the ceiling, and one day when I was snooping in there, because snooping was my favorite hobby, there was a singular box, and when I opened up, it was my dad's Vietnam fatigues, hidden away and willfully forgotten. The warehouse between my grandpa filled with stuff too. It was filled with antiques, and there were cars and inventions, and every time I snooped in there, there was something more to find, all under the watchful eye of more taxidermy animals. There was also this strange building. It was out in our west pasture, and it kind of looked like a grain elevator with big, thick cement walls, and it had these big windows that were blown out, and then there was a bunch of like broken porcelain inside. And I didn't know what that building was originally used for, but I liked to play in it. And I played in it so much that the family deemed it the playhouse. And it was fuel for the imagination to play in there. But then years later, I found out that it was fuel for the bombs as well. It was a yellow D powder sifting building that was purposefully incinerated to burn up all the caustic material before it was sold in '66. Yeah. Probably should have known that. But yeah, I really, I wished that my sister would have played with me. But she was 6 years older, and she just kind of hated the fact that I was born. And so she really reveled when I got in trouble. But we did, I kept to my own devices out there at the Navy base. I mean, family was never too far away, and I was very independent, and so was my sister too. And you can imagine our surprise the day that our parents told us that the very next day, which was a Saturday, we couldn't go outside at all. That the Army was going to be playing war games on our property, and that terrorists were going to be taking over my playhouse, and not to be afraid of the gunfire because they were using blanks. Well, this made my mind swirl. War games on our property, terrorists in my playhouse. This I've got to see. So I hatched a plan, and that next morning, I got up really early and I looked out my bedroom window, and I could see Army guys all the way in the east pasture. And since the playhouse was in the west pasture, I knew that we were surrounded, which really solidified my plan. The night before, I had prepped this slim brown belt and a green water pistol. And I took those and I snuck out my bedroom door. And then I snuck past my sleeping parents' bedroom door. And then I snuck out of our apartment. And then I went down into the sub-basement where I pulled the dusty chair. And I got up into the cupboard and I got my dad's fatigues. And I pulled them down, and I took his olive green pants, and I put them on, and I rolled them up over my kangaroo tennis shoes, and I pulled on his long sleeve olive green shirt, and I rolled up the sleeves, and I buttoned that down, and it had U.S. Army emblazoned in gold above the pocket. And I tucked in my shirt, and I put on my slim brown belt because I didn't want my pants to fall down. And then I took my green water pistol, and I ran. I ran through the warehouse. I ran to the south end. I went into the bathroom in the entry, and I filled it up, and I put it in my pocket, and I was ready. Giant green evergreen trees dotted the west side of our building, nearly all the way to the factory. The plan was to get behind the factory where I could climb up the grass-covered bunker and get a vantage point of my playhouse so I could see those terrorists. There was only one part where speed was going to come into play. There was a road and a parking area in front of the factory. No cover. So I looked out the south end, and I made sure the coast was clear. And when it was, I took off, and I got underneath the first evergreen tree. And I kept going tree to tree underneath, bobbing and weaving, until I got to the last tree. And I made sure that there was nobody around. And I took a deep breath. And then I took 2 speedy steps when I heard, "Freeze! Halt! Stop, soldier! Hands in the air!" 2 army guys came out of nowhere, and they asked me if I was armed. "Yes," I said, and I pulled out my green water pistol, and it had leaked all of its ammunition in my pants. And as I stood there in embarrassment, looking at the sky and horrified at what my parents were going to do, I met eyes with my sister, who had successfully snuck out in a bathing suit, and she was on top of the factory, and she looked at me like, "I'm gonna get you so bad," and then she disappeared. I knew that she was gonna go tell my mom and dad, and in that moment, I decided that being taken prisoner by these 2 army guys was by far the better option. So I pleaded with them. I said, "Look, this was my playhouse, and I really wanted to see the terrorists and or help if I could." And they discussed amongst themselves what to do, and then ultimately decided that that was, a decision for their commander. So they escorted me past the factory and past the grass-covered bunker, and when I looked up, because I really wanted to go up there, I saw that it was covered with army guys. There was army guys in camouflage. They had like nets over them with grass woven through. They even had grass tucked into their bands of their turtle shell helmets. I waved hello. And then I got escorted past the pond that my dad liked to stock with fat bass, and then they escorted me into the pasture where the playhouse came into view. And I could see the terrorists. They were dressed in black, and they had on black masks, and they were armed, and they went from window to window, and they were taunting and jeering. And as we walked along, there were army guys that were pressed against the ground. And I said hello, and I apologized, and oops, as I stepped on a few of them, and I realized that they were in the midst of a sneak attack. And I had potentially given away a few of their locations. We continued on to where there was a group of army guys, and they were around this 4-foot by 4-foot cement slab just randomly on the ground in the pasture, and there was a manhole cover in it. It was an exit to one of the tunnels. And my captors went over and talked to this army guy, and his eyes got really big, and I feared that he was furious. And he came over to me, and he got down on one knee, looked me in the eye, and asked me my name. "Jessica, sir." And then he told me his name. His name was Colonel Lance and that he was the battalion commander. And he told me that he understood that it was my playhouse that the terrorists had taken over, and not to worry because the good guys were going to win, and that I could stay with him until the end of the exercise. And he gave me a pair of binoculars, and I got to listen and watch the art of war. And as the Army guys started coming out of nowhere and taking over the playhouse, it was so very exciting. And then Colonel Lance ordered one of the Army guys to give him his gun, and then he ordered 2 more Army guys to get behind me, and then he handed me an M16. And he showed me how to steady, aim, and fire. And man, that thing had recoil. And the 2 people behind me kept me up. And then he took the gun away and he handed me a grenade. And I had just seen Red Dawn. And I knew exactly what to do. I squeezed the grenade. I pulled the pin and I threw it as far as I could. And it coughed out some smoke and sputtered some sparks. And I helped to liberate my playhouse too. After the exercise, Colonel Lance asked me if I wanted to eat rations with them in the covered ramp. And I knew that I was going to have to ask my parents. I had been gone a long time, and I knew that I was in trouble, so I told Colonel Lance that. And so he got a notebook, and he wrote something out, and then he handed it to like 3 other Army guys that wrote something out as well. And he gave it to my original captors and told them to escort me home and give this to my parents. And so when we made it back to the apartment, I felt pretty confident being, between 2 Army guys as I knocked on the door. And my parents opened up the door, and it was just like a state of shock. And then they got handed the note, and the note said, "To whom it may concern, from Colonel Lance, this is to certify that Jessica Fleming, honorary corporal, helped to liberate her playhouse with Company C on October 6th, 1984. And then it was signed by Colonel Lance and 3 witnesses. And my parents' face went from, shock to like pride. And I got to experience what rations were for lunch. And we had carrot cake for dessert, and the Army guys even gave me a turtle shell helmet of my own, and I was an Army guy for Halloween that year. So like I said, I really loved our Navy base, and in preparation for this story, I got curious about the poor farmers that got kicked off their land, right, to build the Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot. So I started doing some research. And in February of 2023, at 47 years old, I learned that in 1870, the land was purchased, the 80 acres that I grew up on was purchased by my great-great-grandpa on my mom's side, that it was her family, my family, that got separated from the land and legacy and family history due to eminent domain, even as we lived obliviously on it. Thank you.
This is the note from Colonel Lance that Jessica got that day. Just wonderful. What a lovely keepsake.
You already know what it says.
I don't know that I could read his writing. Yeah.
But yeah, this is proof. And so he wants me to share a little something about Andy the Goose real quick, too. So I grew up unconventionally with an inventor grandfather who, if you were in Nebraska in the late 80s, early 90s, you may have heard of Andy the Goose. He was hatched without feet. My grandpa popped on shoes on him. He got sponsored by Nike, got on Johnny Carson's show, and then he got murdered. It's a good story. I hope that you come and see it. It'll be in October, so.
All right. Our last storyteller of the evening is a mother, a storyteller, a dabbling herbalist, and a quote-unquote reformed theater artist, now making her living as a safety director for a local trucking company. A closeted writer for many years, she went public with some of her work after the birth of her second child as a way of coping with the intense feelings of isolation that came along with raising two young children so far from her familial support system. She refers to her creative work as, quote unquote, low pressure creative practice for a more sane practice of motherhood. When not working on one of several extra projects, you can find her hiking the Les Prairie, tending to her garden, or reading tarot for friends. Here to tell her story, and grace will lead us home, please welcome Alanna Reeves.
I'm going to adjust this real quick. Hang on. Maybe.
I know I'm very strong.
Oh, you are? My goodness. Okay. We get there. Okay. Yes, thank you. When my ancestors arrived at Ellis Island in 1913, they were seeking a new home. But what does that mean exactly? A physical address or a place to reside, certainly, but home is more than that, isn't it? Ideally, it's a place where one feels safe, where one can belong and flourish and thrive. And it's all of these things that my ancestors, like many immigrants before them and after them, were seeking when they came to the United States. My great-grandfather, James, was just 2 years old when his family journeyed across the Atlantic Ocean, leaving behind famine and mounting violence in the lead-up to the Irish War of Independence. When they arrived here, they started fresh. They figured out a way to build a new home in New York City. James grows up, and he makes a way for himself in Brooklyn's Irish community. He eventually lands a job at Nassau Savings and Loan, and in his early 20s, he meets Violet, and the two of them marry, and they have a child, Robert, my grandfather. Looking at photos of them in the very early years of their family, it seems that they have a very happy home. Beautiful, doting mother and proud, handsome father, grinning broadly with a smiling baby squished between the two of them. But over the years, the photos fall off. There's a gap. Tuberculosis takes Violet. She spends much of my grandfather's elementary years in a sanatorium. He rarely sees her. And while the treatments help, she eventually succumbs to the disease when my grandfather's about 12 years old. James copes through this entire ordeal by drinking heavily. His only child, Robert, is shuttled to aunts who shuffle him in among their children while James sorts himself out. Despite all of this, my grandfather continues to grow, and in high school, he proves himself to be quite a competitive athlete. He particularly shines in track and cross country, and one day a teammate asks him if he'll join the Fellowship for Christian Athletes. My grandpa figures he'll check it out, and it's there that he says he first got his calling to join the ministry. Robert grows some more. He leaves home. He goes to seminary school, and while there, one day walking up the steps of the cafeteria, a classmate stops him saying, "Hey, Bob, have you met Grace? She's amazing." In his later years, my grandfather would always end that story with, "And she was. She was." Anyone who met my grandma, Grace, knew that my grandfather was absolutely right about this fact. Bob and Grace get married, and they set off. My grandfather, a newly ordained minister, and my grandmother with a degree in religious studies. They want a big, bustling family. But after lots and lots of heartbreak, they have 3 children. Beth Ann dies only a few hours after birth, but Mark and Joanna, my mother, thrive. The Baptists basically require that my grandparents start their church from the ground up, and this proves to be a very daunting task, especially while trying to support a young family. They move to the Methodists, who rotate their clergy every few years, but who also provide basics like housing for their clergy families. Grace very quickly becomes the quiet backbone of my grandfather's ministry, although she never would have said as much out loud. Her love and, well, grace is boundless, and she is beloved in every community they are assigned to. My grandfather, on the other hand, is, well, my mother tells this story about bringing home vocabulary homework from school. And my grandfather was quizzing her about it one night over the dinner table, and sanction is one of the words that she has this week. Now, sanction is one of these funny words that has 2 meanings that are nearly opposite in meaning. And when my grandfather asks her what it means, my mother responds that it means to give official permission. "No, it doesn't," says my grandfather. "It means to punish." Well, yeah, my mom says. It actually means both. "No, it doesn't," says my grandfather. Now, my mother's a very smart and a little bit cunning little girl, and she pauses for a moment, and she says, "Well, why don't we look it up in the dictionary?" She's got him. This is absolute proof that she is right and he is wrong, and she cannot wait until he reads those definitions, except that my grandfather flatly refuses to look in the dictionary, barking at her, "I don't need to look it up. I know what it means." This is exactly the man I remember growing up. Gruff, sober, and irrefutably right. He's no easier on my grandmother, who over the decades takes to navigating around him and trying to convince the rest of us to do the same by saying, "Oh, just drop it," anytime an argument arises. When things get particularly heated, my grandmother will suddenly stand up from the couch saying, "Well, who wants to go get some ice cream?" as a way of shuttling us out of the house and away from this argument in which there is sure to be no winners, because we are a stubborn lot after all. And then in January of 2002, my grandmother passes away from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She must have known that her time was coming, because she had somehow managed to convince 8 doctors to allow her to temporarily leave the hospital in order to spend Christmas at home with the family just that previous month. When we arrive at the hospital, my grandmother is pushing away at something that none of the rest of us can see. And she's saying, "No, no, 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 no." After a few rounds of this over the next few hours, my mother finally whispers in her ear that if she has to go, it's okay. We'll be okay. And we'll look after Grandpa for her. My grandmother rests quietly for the next few hours. And then suddenly, late that afternoon, she sits up in her hospital bed, arms outstretched, and she says, "Yes, yes." And she lays back down, and she's gone. As the nurse announces my grandmother's time of death, my grandfather's shoulders slump slightly, but a flat, "Oh, I was afraid of that," is all that my grandfather says in response. I'll never forget the image of my grandfather leaving the hospital that night, walking in front of me down the hallway with my grandmother's purse in his hand and her overcoat slung over his arm. I don't ever remember him crying, but I do remember him looking shrunken or diminished somehow. In the 12 years that my grandfather spends as a widower, he undergoes some changes. He suddenly has an interest in our sporting events and speech competitions, and he starts attending them on occasion. He joins a couple of clubs in our hometown, and don't get me wrong, he is still irrefutably right, but as long as you know to avoid certain topics of conversation, it is suddenly within the realm of possibility to have a civil and, on occasion, even pleasant conversation with him. He joins the church choir, bless them, and he loves to brag of his high Irish tenor voice to anyone who will listen, proving his perceived talent by singing a few notes in as high a falsetto as he can manage. He rekindles a love for the opera singer Mario Lanza, and he loves to lavish praise on his now deceased wife, recounting stories of their courtship together. As the years go on, we notice that my grandfather's stories and recollections start to become more and more outlandish. He begins to live in somewhat of a fantasy world. He tells me one day that his next door neighbor, who was my mother's high school algebra teacher, as well as my high school algebra teacher, and who was a lovely man and outstanding member of our community, my grandfather informs me that this man is the leader of a motorcycle gang that is out to get him. He also believes that the post office is part of this ring of crime, and he believes that they're tampering with his mail and intercepting it, and so he decides that he's going to start mailing all of his mail through the central post office in Omaha because it's more mechanized, and so the gang won't be able to get to him there. My grandfather also starts telling us fantastical things like that he can speak to other people using telepathy. And then he discloses to me one day that he is in classes for a concealed carry permit. My grandfather has never owned guns up until this point in his life. I immediately call the sheriff and I tell him that this is a terrible idea. I tell him that this is not safe for my grandfather, nor is it safe for our community members. And the sheriff is very sympathetic to my phone call. And he tells me that unless I have legal custody of my grandfather, there's really not much he can legally do. He does offer me the olive branch of putting my grandfather's permit on a 48-hour temporary hold. Miraculously, 48 hours is just long enough for my grandfather to completely forget about the permit. In another terrifying series of events, my grandfather attempts to take a trip to Ireland with nothing but his passport, about $200 in cash, and no plans upon arrival other than to look up our distant cousins in the phone book. We head him off at the airport in the nick of time due to a voicemail that he had left on my mother's cell phone saying, "Hey, You might not be able to get a hold of me for a couple of weeks, but don't worry, I'm just in Ireland. Of course we worry. We head up to the airport, and when we get there, my grandfather's adamant that he's going on this trip. There is no amount of pleading and cajoling and arguing that is going to make him change his mind. Things are starting to get a little heated and a little bit louder, and we start to kind of draw the attention of other people around us in the airport. And in the midst of all of this, my mother wanders off to a bank of payphones. I'm trying to be present with my grandfather, but I'm also looking at my mother a little incredulous, like, what the hell are you doing right now? And she picks up one of the receivers and she presses some numbers and she stands there calmly. And then she says, "Hi, Cousin Tom? Yeah, this is Joanna. Yep, Bob Hamilton's daughter." "Oh, yeah, I'm so glad you remember. Yeah. Yeah, how are you?" Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. This one-sided conversation that my mother is having goes on for about 5 minutes, and then she calmly hangs the phone back up, and she turns around and she informs my grandfather that there's been a death in the family, and it's nobody that we know, but a great-great-aunt has passed away, and so all of the Irish cousins are going to her funeral, and they're gonna be on the other side of the country for the next week and a half. Now's not really the best time for him to go on this trip, but, Cousin Tom said we can call him in a few weeks, and we'll make a plan, and we'll get him out to Ireland. This charade satisfies my grandfather, and he agrees to leave the airport. The moment we step outside of the building, however, it is clear that my grandfather has absolutely no idea where he has parked his car. He doesn't even know if he's parked it in a garage or an open lot. No idea. We spend the next 2 hours driving through parking lot after parking lot after parking lot at about 5 miles an hour, all of us with our faces pressed against different sides of my mother's car, trying to locate my grandfather's vehicle. While we're doing this, curiosity gets the better of me, and I open my grandfather's suitcase to take a peek inside. It looks like it's been tossed together by a small child who's trying to run away from home. There's a pair of pants, some boxer shorts, a couple of pairs of socks, but no shirt. He did pack a tie, though, for some reason. No sleeping clothes, no toiletries. It's random odds and ends, but nothing that adds up to a competent adult planning to be away from home for 2 weeks. We know that my grandfather has dementia, but his paranoia means that he hasn't seen a doctor in the 12 years since my grandmother's death. He refuses to go. We have no way to get a diagnosis, no way to get him the help that it is clear that he needs. I've exhausted about every resource I can think of at this point, trying to figure out how to care for or at least manage my grandfather. I finally decide to call his pastor. My grandfather's retired, but he's very active in one of the local churches. And so I set up a meeting with his pastor, and I tell him that I am concerned about my grandfather's health, and I am concerned about his mental capacity. And if there is ever anything that we should know, to please not hesitate to call. And I pass on my cell phone number. This is how I'm the one who receives the call, late one January, that my grandfather is being transported by ambulance to Jenny Edmondson Hospital. A neighbor has found my grandfather lying down on his front stoop. After calling the ambulance, she didn't know who else to call, and it just so happens that she is a member at the same church as my grandfather. And so she called their pastor. who had received my phone number just 2 weeks prior to this incident. I thank her for her phone call. I thank her for getting medical attention to my grandfather. And I call my mother, and we all head up to the hospital. When we arrive at the hospital, I learned that my grandfather had likely been on his front stoop for several hours in below freezing temperatures before he was found. He's had a heart attack, and he also has a brain hemorrhage, but they believe that that started earlier in the week because when the EMTs arrived on the scene, they report that he already had a bandage on the back of his head. I find out much later that on one of his trips to the Omaha post office, my grandfather had fallen down in the lobby. He hit his head hard enough that the staff members there had called an ambulance. He was transported to the closest hospital, and once there, he refused treatment beyond the bandage on his head. He would not let anyone check his pulse. He would not let anyone even listen to his heart or lungs with a stethoscope. He apparently got quite agitated and insisted that someone call him a taxi to take him back to his car so that he could go home. And so that's what the hospital did. The day before he was found by his neighbor, I had had a long phone conversation with my grandpa, and he had never mentioned any of this. But despite all of these circumstances, when we enter the exam room where my grandfather is being held, he is in high spirits. He is joking and flirting a little bit with the nurses, and he's singing in his high Irish tenor voice to anyone who will listen. And as we walk through the door, he says, "Wow, this is one way to get all my family together." The silver lining of my grandfather's dementia is that it actually made him a much happier and slightly more joyful person, which I know is not the case for everyone, so at least we had that. At 82 years old, my grandfather undergoes a double bypass and brain surgery. He comes out of both surgeries far better than anyone could have anticipated. After a few weeks of recovery in the hospital, he's transferred to Glen Haven Nursing Home to continue his recovery process. But once there, determined to prove that he should be allowed to go home, my grandfather starts to push his limits. He gets up out of his wheelchair without supervision. He basically refuses to use the walker. And on one of these occasions, my grandfather falls and he hits his head. He has another brain hemorrhage and another brain surgery. And this time, the surgeon can't stop the bleed. Palliative care is called to talk to the family about our options. My grandfather's moved to hospice, and we all gather round for the waiting. It is incredibly difficult to watch a man who has been so full of fight his entire life just slowly slip away. My grandfather feathers in and out of consciousness. And he asks us to hold his hand. This display of vulnerability is shocking. And we all do so, but we do it very awkwardly because this act is completely foreign between us. It's decided among our family members that I should be the one to talk to my grandfather, to give him permission to go. In what turns out to be his last moments of consciousness, I tell my grandfather that he is loved. I tell him that we all know that he did his absolute best while he was here. And I tell him that if it is time to go and join Grandma Grace then he should do so. We are all cared for. We will all be okay. My grandfather hasn't opened his eyes in some time, but he does nod, which is my only indication that he's hearing any of this. And at the end, my mother says that when my grandfather meets my grandma Grace, who was raised devout Baptist and never allowed to dance growing up, she says that when he meets her in heaven, they can have a dance together. My grandfather raises his eyebrows and nearly smiles in response. 2 days later, we're told that my grandfather's time is very near. We all sit in his room, and Mario Lanza, the soundtrack to my grandfather's death process, still plays quietly in the background, and in case he can still enjoy it. As we all sit and watch my grandfather's chest rise and fall with less and less frequency, Mario Lanza sings Amazing Grace. And my grandfather takes his last breath on the lyric, "And grace will lead me home." I like to think that she did, and that there was dancing involved. I thought for a long time about how to end this story, because my impulse as a storyteller is to somehow tidy it up or put a bow on it, but the reality is that my relationship with my grandfather was not tidy, and it wasn't for any of our family members, to be perfectly honest. It was messy and complicated. And often it was very, very difficult. Current culture may have labeled my grandfather as toxic and suggested that maybe I should cut him out or somehow restrict my relationship with him as a way of preserving my own emotional and mental health. But I've had the privilege of being able to examine some of my grandfather's history. I have the privilege of having a little bit of insight to the way that my grandfather was completely untethered from any stable sense of home for a vast majority of his formative years. My grandfather's certainty and his somewhat authoritarian attitude was very likely the sword and the shield that he carried as a way of coping with a childhood that was wildly uncertain and full of things that were wildly beyond his control. And while it may have been easier, or certainly more convenient, to have put more stringent boundaries around our relationship, for me, I have absolutely no regrets about the fact that when my grandfather finally showed us some vulnerability, we met him with grace. And I do believe that if all of us can carry those two things with us wherever we go, vulnerability and grace, it would go a long way toward helping us get to a place where we can all belong and flourish and thrive. They might just lead us home. Thank you.
All right, Laura Kelly, Tim Guthrie, Jessica Korgie, Alanna Reeves. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope to see you again. Have a safe trip home and a wonderful evening. Thank you.